Vladimir Lenin was the founder of the Soviet Union, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution that overthrew the Russian Provisional Government in October 1917, and the architect of the world's first socialist state. He was a revolutionary theorist whose writings shaped communist ideology, a political strategist who seized and consolidated power in the midst of chaos and civil war, and a ruthless leader whose policies caused enormous suffering while transforming Russia from a backward agrarian empire into a modern, centralized state. Lenin's historical significance is undeniable. His ideas influenced millions, and his actions shaped the 20th century in profound ways. Yet for all his importance, Lenin's actual daily routine and working methods are less familiar to many people than the broad outlines of his political career. So what did Vladimir Lenin actually do all day? How did he spend his working hours? What were the activities, habits, and routines that filled the days of this revolutionary leader during different periods of his career? Today, we'll reconstruct Lenin's typical daily life during his years of underground revolutionary activity before 1917. During the tumultuous period of revolution and civil war from 1917 to 1921, and during his final years from 1922 to his death in 1924, when illness increasingly limited his activities. We'll examine how he worked, how he made decisions, how he communicated his ideas, and how his daily habits reflected his personality and his approach to revolutionary politics. This is a story about discipline and dedication, about a man whose entire life was consumed by revolutionary politics, about how ideology shaped daily routines, and about the mundane activities through which one man helped create a new form of government that would endure for 7 decades and influence the world for a century. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who adopted the revolutionary pseudonym Lenin, was born in 1870 in Simbirsk, a provincial town on the Volga River in the Russian Empire. He came from an educated middle-class family. His father was a school inspector, and his mother came from a family of physicians and professionals. Lenin received a good education and showed intellectual ability from a young age, excelling particularly in languages and in studies of history and politics. The event that transformed his life and set him on his revolutionary path was the execution of his older brother Alexander in 1887 for participating in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. This family tragedy radicalized young Lenin and directed him toward revolutionary activities and toward hatred of the autocratic Russian state that had killed his brother. Lenin studied law at university, though he was expelled for participating in student protests. He completed his law degree as an external student and briefly practiced law, but his real focus was always on revolutionary politics and on studying Marxist theory. By the 1890s, Lenin was deeply involved in underground revolutionary work, organizing workers, writing and distributing illegal literature, and developing his ideas about how revolution could be achieved in Russia. His activities led to his arrest in 1895, and he spent over a year in prison, followed by 3 years of exile in Siberia, a period he used for intensive study and writing. After his Siberian exile ended in 1900, Lenin left Russia and spent most of the next 17 years in exile in Western Europe, primarily in Switzerland, but also in Germany, England, and other countries, only returning to Russia in April 1917 after the February Revolution had overthrown the Tsar. Lenin's daily routine during his years of exile from 1900 to 1917 established patterns that would characterize much of his working life. Lenin was extraordinarily disciplined and dedicated, treating revolutionary politics as a full-time profession requiring systematic work and study. His typical day during the exile years began relatively early, usually around 8 or 9 in the morning, earlier than many intellectuals and revolutionaries who kept late hours. Lenin valued regular schedules and believed in maintaining good health through proper sleep, exercise, and diet, viewing these as necessary for sustained revolutionary work rather than as bourgeois indulgences. After waking, Lenin would have a simple breakfast, usually tea and bread, as his tastes in food were modest and he had limited funds during much of his exile. He lived frugally, spending money primarily on books, newspapers, and revolutionary activities, rather than on personal comfort or luxury. After breakfast, Lenin's mornings were devoted to reading and study. He was a voracious reader who studied constantly, reading newspapers from Russia and other countries to follow political developments, reading theoretical works on Marxism, economics, philosophy, and politics, and reading history and other subjects that informed his understanding of society and revolution. Lenin read in multiple languages including Russian, German, English, and French, giving him access to a wide range of sources. He took extensive notes while reading, filling notebooks with summaries, quotations, and his own analysis and commentary. These reading notebooks, many of which survive, reveal Lenin's systematic approach to study and his constant work to understand theory and to apply it to practical political questions. Lenin treated reading not as leisure, but as work, as essential preparation for revolutionary activity and for developing the theoretical foundation for political action. Mid to late morning often involved writing, which was Lenin's primary activity throughout his adult life. Lenin was an enormously prolific writer who produced thousands of articles, pamphlets, books, and letters over his career. Writing was how he developed and communicated his ideas, how he influenced other revolutionaries, how he debated opponents, and how he maintained leadership of the Bolshevik faction, despite years of physical separation from Russia. Lenin wrote about theoretical questions of Marxism, about political strategy and tactics, about current events, and their implications for the revolutionary movement, about organizational questions, and about virtually every aspect of politics and revolution. He wrote clearly and forcefully, with a polemical style that combined theoretical argument with harsh criticism of opponents and with practical proposals for action. Lenin's writing routine was disciplined and productive. He would sit at his desk with his notes and sources and would write in longhand, producing drafts that he would revise and refine. He wrote quickly when inspired and when he had clarity about his argument. But he also revised carefully and thought deeply about how to present his ideas most effectively. His wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, often served as his secretary, typing up his handwritten drafts, and she was also his closest political collaborator and assistant throughout his life. The writing Lenin produced during his exile years included major theoretical works like What is to be Done, which outlined his vision for a revolutionary party, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which analyzed the economic basis of imperialism, and countless articles for Bolshevik newspapers and journals. This written output established Lenin as a leading Marxist theoretician and as the intellectual leader of the Bolshevik faction, roles that were essential for his later political success. Lunch was usually a simple meal taken relatively quickly, as Lenin did not emphasize food or dining as important activities, but rather as necessities to be handled efficiently so he could return to work. After lunch, Lenin's afternoons often included meetings with other revolutionaries who were in exile or who were visiting from Russia. These meetings served multiple purposes, including coordinating revolutionary activities, discussing political strategy, debating theoretical questions, maintaining connections with comrades, and managing the Bolshevik organization. Lenin was deeply involved in organizational work, understanding that revolution required not just correct theory, but also disciplined organization and effective coordination of activities. He spent considerable time on correspondence, writing letters to revolutionaries in Russia and in other exile locations, providing guidance, settling disputes, discussing plans, and maintaining his leadership position within the Bolshevik movement. Lenin's organizational work included editing Bolshevik newspapers and journals, which were printed abroad and smuggled into Russia, where they were distributed illegally. This editorial work consumed significant time and energy, as Lenin was intimately involved in decisions about what to publish, in editing articles, in writing pieces himself, and in managing the practical aspects of production and distribution. The newspapers and journals were essential tools for spreading Bolshevik ideas, for maintaining communication with revolutionaries inside Russia, and for establishing the Bolshevik faction's distinct identity and program. Lenin treated this editorial and publishing work as central to revolutionary activity, understanding that ideas and information were weapons in the political struggle. Late afternoon and early evening often included more reading and writing, or sometimes outdoor exercise, which Lenin considered important for health and for mental clarity. He enjoyed walking and hiking, and he would take long walks in the areas where he lived, using the time to think about political problems and to maintain physical fitness. Lenin also enjoyed chess and occasionally played with friends and comrades, viewing it as a mental exercise and as a break from work, though even his leisure activities were relatively simple and were subordinated to his primary focus on revolutionary politics. He also enjoyed music and would occasionally attend concerts, particularly appreciating classical music, though he had limited time for cultural activities given his work commitments. Evenings often included more meetings and discussions, as revolutionaries in exile would gather to debate political questions, to discuss news from Russia, and to coordinate activities. These gatherings combined political work with social interaction, as the community of Russian revolutionaries in exile was relatively small and tight-knit, and relationships formed during these years were important, both personally and politically. Lenin participated actively in these discussions, often dominating them with his forceful arguments and his clarity of vision. But he also listened and learned from others, even as he worked to convince them of his positions. After these evening gatherings concluded, Lenin would often do more reading or writing, working late into the evening before going to bed, usually around midnight or shortly after, maintaining a relatively regular sleep schedule that allowed him to wake early and begin the cycle again. This daily routine of reading, writing, organizing, and discussing politics continued for years during Lenin's exile, occasionally interrupted by the need to move to new locations when police pressure increased or when political circumstances changed, but always returning to the basic pattern of disciplined revolutionary work. Lenin lived modestly during these years, often in small apartments or rented rooms, with limited possessions beyond his books and papers, and with limited income from writing and from financial support provided by the Bolshevik organization. His entire life was organized around revolutionary politics, and he subordinated everything else, including personal comfort, leisure, and even to some extent, personal relationships, to the demands of revolutionary work. This extraordinary dedication and discipline were essential to Lenin's eventual success, as they allowed him to maintain leadership and to develop the theoretical and organizational basis for the Bolshevik Revolution, despite years of exile and separation from Russia. Lenin's daily routine changed dramatically when he returned to Russia in April 1917, after the February Revolution had overthrown Tsar Nicholas II and established a provisional government. Lenin arrived at Petrograd's Finland station on April 3, 1917, after traveling through Germany in a sealed train, a journey arranged by German authorities who hoped Lenin's revolutionary activities would destabilize Russia and help Germany's war effort. From the moment of his arrival, when he delivered a speech to welcoming crowds outlining his radical program, Lenin became the most dynamic and influential figure in Russian revolutionary politics, and his daily activities shifted from the study and writing of exile to the direct political leadership of revolution. During the 8 months from April to October 1917, Lenin's days were consumed with political agitation, organizing, writing, and strategizing to position the Bolsheviks to seize power. He would wake relatively early and immediately begin working on the political situation, meeting with Bolshevik leaders to discuss strategy, writing articles and pamphlets arguing for his positions, attending meetings of various revolutionary organizations, including Soviets and party committees, and giving speeches to workers, soldiers, and other groups. Lenin's famous April theses, which he presented immediately upon arriving in Russia, outlined a radical program calling for all power to the Soviets, for immediate peace, for redistribution of land to peasants, and for socialist revolution. These positions were initially rejected even by many Bolsheviks as too extreme. But Lenin worked tirelessly through speeches, articles, and meetings to convince his party and to build support among workers and soldiers for Bolshevik positions. Lenin's daily schedule during 1917 was irregular and adapted to political circumstances. He would attend lengthy meetings that could stretch for many hours, discussing party strategy and debating with other revolutionaries. He would work on articles and pamphlets, often writing multiple pieces per day, which would be printed in Bolshevik newspapers and distributed widely. He would meet with workers' delegations, with soldiers from military units, with peasant representatives, listening to their concerns and explaining Bolshevik positions, building the political support that would be necessary for seizing power. He would participate in demonstrations and rallies, though he was also cautious about his personal security, given the threat of arrest or assassination. Indeed, after the July days, when the Provisional Government moved to arrest Bolshevik leaders, Lenin went into hiding for several months, shaving his beard and wearing a wig as disguise, living in safe houses in Petrograd's suburbs and in Finland. Even while in hiding, Lenin continued his political work, writing constantly, including his major theoretical work, The State and Revolution, and maintaining leadership of the Bolsheviks, through letters and through secret meetings with party leaders. The culmination of this period of revolutionary activity came in late October 1917, when Lenin directed the Bolshevik insurrection that overthrew the Provisional Government and brought the Bolsheviks to power. During the crucial days of October 24th to 25th, Lenin was directly involved in coordinating the uprising, meeting with the Military Revolutionary Committee that was directing operations, overseeing the seizure of key points in Petrograd, and making critical decisions about timing and tactics. When the Winter Palace was captured and the Provisional Government arrested on the evening of October 25th, power passed to the Congress of Soviets, where the Bolsheviks had a majority, and Lenin emerged as the leader of the new Soviet government, becoming chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, effectively the head of government. Lenin's daily routine after the October Revolution and during the subsequent years of civil war from 1917 to 1921 was extraordinarily demanding and exhausting. He worked exceptionally long hours, often 18 or more hours per day, dealing with the enormous challenges of consolidating power, fighting a civil war against multiple enemies, managing economic collapse, suppressing opposition, and attempting to build a socialist society in the midst of chaos and violence. Lenin's typical day during this period would begin around 9 or 10 in the morning at his office in the Kremlin, where the Soviet government had moved from Petrograd to Moscow in March 1918 due to the threat of German advance. He would begin with meetings with his closest associates, including Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, and other Bolshevik leaders, discussing the military situation, economic problems, and political challenges. These meetings were often short and focused, as decisions needed to be made quickly and implemented immediately given the crises the regime faced. Lenin's office in the Kremlin was relatively modest, furnished simply with a desk, chairs, bookshelves, and maps showing military and economic situations. He maintained the plain lifestyle he had developed during exile, living in a small apartment in the Kremlin with Krupskaya, and working in conditions that were far from luxurious, despite his position as leader of the world's first socialist state. Throughout the morning and into early afternoon, Lenin would have a constant stream of visitors, including government ministers reporting on their areas of responsibility, military commanders discussing the Civil War situation, economic managers dealing with food supplies and industrial production, party officials addressing political questions, and delegations from workers, peasants, and soldiers. Lenin would listen to reports, ask penetrating questions, make decisions, and issue instructions, all while working through a massive volume of paperwork, including reports, proposals, complaints, and requests that poured into the government daily. Lenin was famous for his attention to detail and his insistence on concrete facts and figures rather than vague generalities. He would interrogate officials about specifics, demanding to know exact numbers, concrete plans, and practical implementation methods, rather than accepting abstract promises or theoretical discussions. This focus on practical details, combined with his broader theoretical understanding and strategic vision, made him an effective leader, though it also meant he worked exhausting hours trying to manage countless details of government administration. Lenin signed off on an enormous number of documents daily, making decisions on matters large and small, from major questions of war strategy and economic policy to relatively minor administrative issues that nonetheless required leadership attention given the breakdown of normal administrative functioning during the chaos of revolution and civil war. Lunch for Lenin during these years was usually a quick meal taken at his desk or in a brief break from meetings, typically simple food like soup, bread, and tea, eaten rapidly so he could return to work. He had no time or inclination for elaborate meals or for dining as a social or political ritual, viewing eating as a necessity to be handled efficiently. After lunch, Lenin's afternoon would continue with more meetings, more paperwork, more decisions on the countless issues requiring his attention. He also devoted time to writing, continuing to produce articles, pamphlets, and directives explaining Bolshevik policies, responding to critics, and providing ideological guidance. His writing during this period was often more immediately practical and less theoretical than during his exile years, focused on current problems of government and revolution rather than on abstract theoretical questions, though he continued to ground his practical policies in Marxist theory. Late afternoon and evening often included meetings of the Politburo or of the Council of People's Commissars, where the most important decisions about policy and strategy were made collectively by Bolshevik leadership, though Lenin's voice was dominant and his positions usually prevailed. These meetings could last many hours, stretching late into the evening, and sometimes into the early morning hours, as leaders debated strategy, argued about policy, and tried to manage the multiple crises the regime faced. The civil war against white armies supported by foreign intervention, the economic collapse and famine, the resistance from peasants angered by grain requisitioning, the opposition from other socialist parties, and the countless practical challenges of governing all required constant attention and decision-making. Lenin participated actively in these meetings, presenting his views forcefully, listening to others, demanding information and analysis, and ultimately shaping the decisions that were made. After these evening meetings concluded, often around midnight or later, Lenin would often do more work, reading reports, writing notes and instructions, planning for the next day's activities. He would typically not go to bed until 1 or 2 in the morning, getting only 5 or 6 hours of sleep before beginning again the next morning. This schedule was exhausting and took a toll on his health, but Lenin maintained it for years, driven by his commitment to the revolution and by the genuine crises that demanded constant attention. His wife Krupskaya, who also worked in the government in education, worried about his health and tried to encourage him to rest more and to take breaks. But Lenin's sense of urgency and responsibility made it difficult for him to slow down. During the Civil War years, Lenin also devoted time to security and to suppressing opposition, working closely with Felix Dzerzhinsky, who headed the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police. Lenin signed orders for arrests and executions of political opponents, approved terror campaigns against class enemies, and generally used ruthless violence to consolidate Bolshevik power and to intimidate opposition. These activities, conducted through normal bureaucratic processes of signing orders and issuing directives, represented some of Lenin's most criminal actions and demonstrated that he was willing to use any methods, including mass terror, to achieve political goals. His daily work thus included not just governing and policy making, but also directing state violence on a massive scale, activities that he justified through Marxist ideology and through the argument that revolutionary violence was necessary to defeat counter-revolution and to build socialism. In August 1918, Lenin was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt by Fanny Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary who opposed Bolshevik dictatorship. Lenin was shot twice, with bullets lodging in his neck and shoulder, injuries that caused significant blood loss, and that came close to killing him. He recovered after several weeks, though the assassination attempt left him weakened and may have contributed to his later health problems. The attack led to an intensification of the Red Terror, with thousands of suspected opponents executed in retaliation. After recovering, Lenin returned to his exhausting work schedule, though with somewhat reduced hours, as his health required. By 1921, the Civil War had been won by the Bolsheviks, and the immediate survival of the Soviet state was secured. But the country was devastated by years of war, revolution, and economic collapse. Lenin recognized that some of the harsh policies of war communism, including forced grain requisitioning and suppression of market activities, needed to be modified, and he introduced the new economic policy in 1921, which allowed some private enterprise and market mechanisms while maintaining state control of major industries and political dictatorship. Lenin's daily work during this period included overseeing this policy shift, managing debates within the party about it, and trying to guide the Soviet Union's economic recovery and political consolidation. However, Lenin's ability to maintain his previous pace of work was declining due to health problems that began to manifest in 1921 and worsened dramatically in 1922. He suffered from headaches, insomnia, and other symptoms that were likely caused by atherosclerosis affecting blood flow to his brain, possibly related to the 1918 assassination attempt and the bullets that had never been removed, though the exact medical situation remains debated. In May 1922, Lenin suffered his first major stroke, which paralyzed his right side and affected his speech. He partially recovered over the summer and attempted to return to work, but he was clearly unable to maintain his previous schedule and capacity. He suffered additional strokes in December 1922 and in March 1923, which left him increasingly incapacitated, unable to speak clearly, and largely paralyzed. Lenin's final 2 years, from mid-1922 to his death on January 21, 1924, were marked by declining health and by his inability to work at the level he had maintained throughout his adult life. His daily routine during this period was dictated by illness rather than by political work. He would wake late after difficult nights of insomnia and pain. He would be attended by doctors and by Krupskaya, who cared for him devotedly despite the strain. He would try to read and to stay informed about political developments, but his ability to concentrate and to process information was diminished. He would dictate brief notes and letters when his condition allowed, including his famous Testament, in which he assessed the leading Bolsheviks and warned about Stalin's accumulation of power, a document that would be suppressed after Lenin's death and that would not become widely known until after Stalin's death decades later. Lenin spent much of his final period at Gorky, a country estate near Moscow where he could rest away from the demands of the Kremlin. His days at Gorky were quiet and sad, a dramatic contrast to his previous life of constant activity and engagement. He would spend time in a wheelchair or in bed, would be taken for short rides or walks when weather and his condition permitted, would listen to music on a gramophone, and would spend long hours in the reduced state of a man whose mind and body had been destroyed by illness. Krupskaya read to him, and a few close associates were allowed to visit. But he was largely isolated from the political life that had been his entire world. His ability to communicate declined to the point where he could barely speak. And by the final months of 1923 and early 1924, he was almost entirely incapacitated. He died on January 21st, 1924, at age 53, having suffered multiple strokes that had progressively destroyed his brain function. His death ended a life entirely devoted to revolution and ended the first chapter of Soviet history, as power passed to collective leadership that would eventually be dominated by Stalin.